What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Parisi podcast. Very special guest today. I don't say that with everyone. Go back and listen to the old pods if you don't believe me. Very special guest, Seth Forman. Seth, I'm going to let you do your own introductions. I've struck out on the last two that I've done. I've just missed like very key things on our guest's behalf. So I'm going to let you do the introductions, but Seth Forman is our guest today. Seth, what's up?
Hey, what's going on? I hate doing introductions of myself.
Do you want me to try?
One of the things
I'll try.
I can't stand doing it, but I'm gonna do it, and I'll do it anyway. Just to give some background. We'll get some background on what I've been doing, and that'll be good. So, Seth Forman. I have a master's degree in exercise science, focused in strength and conditioning from Springfield College. That was way back in the day. And then from there, I went down to IMG Academies, where I was working with Bommarito, Loren, Seagrave, Dave Donatucci, a whole bunch of coaches who mentored me while I was there. And that was an amazing experience, which led to me opening my own brick and mortar facility back up here in the Northeast in Connecticut. And I opened that in 2004. And had that brick and mortar through 2018. So 14 years with the brick and mortar. And my career kind of evolved during that time, working with athletes, working with the general public, working with the parents of the athletes. Some of those parents of athletes, I started working with like 15 years ago, and I still work with them now. So it's interesting. The athletes like have a cycle, right? Because you can only be an athlete for so long, and then you move on. So the parents are the ones who kind of stick for a long period of time, which was interesting. But from there, I met Kaye, who's the owner of Kayezen Vector, which is an equipment company, provides this kind of dial-in resistance change with tubing, and has a way that you can hook any kind of an accessory you want onto it. So a lot of versatility in the ways that you can use that product. And I did some primary research on that product with EMG, which was really cool. And we'll probably be able to get into during this podcast a little bit. But from there, I became the head of education at that company. I met Bill Parisi a couple years ago now, before the pandemic had hit, like literally 1 month before the pandemic had hit. And, we hit it off pretty well. Like he liked the knowledge, the education, the stuff I was bringing to the table with the product, and then got into the Parisi network side and the fascia training side. So connective tissue was always a huge part of my process in training, because at IMG, we had worked with the athletic trainers, massage therapists would come down and work with us during the NFL Combine prep. And we got to see kind of how do these different disciplines work together, and how do these different modalities help one another for the performance of the athlete. So I've been working side by side with massage therapists for almost 20 years now. And I'm actually in massage therapy school myself right now.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, so I'm working through that, which I'll be done with in September, and that's been an awesome experience. Another way to kind of build on top of the tools that I have to help athletes train. So that's kind of like the overview of what I've been up to.
It lets people know that you're not like me, some schmuck on the other. You're the guy, like you're the brain. I'm the witty, like you're Batman. I'm Robin. I'll do that.
No, I wouldn't.
No, totally. Unless you want to go.
I wouldn't say it that way, but yeah.
Oh, totally. No way. I'm just some schmuck.
No.
I work with the smart people, but I like to think that I'm smart enough to know that I know nothing and to ask good questions, which has put me on this podcast. And in our conversations that we've had in various formats here, one thing that's always stood out, Seth, with you is that you have this really good ability to take the research, the literature, and even though it's published literature, and we can talk about this, I'm sure, in depth here in a couple minutes, but you can take it and you can dissolve it and pull out what is pertinent and what is useful to you as a trainer with the population you work with. And that skill in this industry, I think it was brought up on a call we were on earlier this week, like trainers a lot of times, and I don't think it's necessarily their fault. I don't want to say it have people think it's like that, but if someone, like if you told me to do something, I'd be like, yeah, like Seth's a smart guy. Like if he's seeing results with it, it's gonna be good, right? But I might not necessarily put my own filter on it and say like, whoa, is that information useful? Does it apply to what I'm trying to do? Does it apply to the client base that I work with? And that skill for a lot of trainers and sports performance coaches, I feel has dissolved over the last decade with the rise of social media, the ability for industry experts, industry veterans, maybe that aren't necessarily quote unquote experts, but veterans of the industry to get their name and their information out into the public. It has skewed some of the, I'll say the bandwidth or the brain width of the profession itself. So that's really what I wanted to focus on with today's podcast. I'm sure we will go through a ton of different tangents along the way, but for those listening, I'm not sure what the clickbaity title is going to be of this podcast, but it is really going to come down to just talking research, how to understand it, how to put the BS meter on it. And then, like, I think one thing I'd really like to hear from your perspective, Seth, is like, if you're a trainer, a young trainer, even if you're a veteran trainer, you're like, yeah, I really should check out more quality research sources. Like, what are those sources? And then what do you look for, right? Like, what's a red flag? What's not a red flag? Like, what is it? Is it really as easy as skipping to the conclusion, like read the abstract and then read the conclusion and the practical application and like hope that that's close enough, So those are kind of the overviews, but where I would like to start, Seth, unless you have a specific starting point you'd like to touch on, I would like to just hear from you, like in today's world, and your stance on this, how important is staying up with the latest research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think staying up with the latest research is really important. And the reason I think that is because the tools that we have technologically have advanced and they're advancing so fast that we're getting new insights, new observations into the human body, observations we couldn't make before. Right. So that's extremely important because the way that we're set up with education, and this is really kind of across the planet now, the Western approach to thinking is really a reductionist approach. And what I mean by that is, like, if you open up any anatomy book, right, you're going to see every individual muscle, its origin, its insertion, its particular action, it within itself. But we don't really get a good integrated idea. How does that muscle really function during movement? What is really going on when you need to stabilize the shoulder, right? We could say the teres minor is going to be helpful in external rotation of the shoulder. Okay, well, that's nice. What does it do when we're going into extension during the arm action or sprinting? And why does it do it? Like, we're going to start getting answers on these types of questions because we're getting a better ability to look into the body. So I think there are two things that are important for keeping up with primary research. One is primary research is going to be the source of an original thought that you can place into a structure, more of like how you organize knowledge for yourself and what you're doing for your clients. This is an extremely important thing, to organize the knowledge, and doing it by secondary sources. Like if I just read some articles written by somebody who referenced some articles, I'm getting their opinion on what that article is giving them, right? But that's not for me. I'm like, no, I need to look at the source. And to go to one of your earlier questions, if I jump to the conclusion or if I jump to the discussion, is that enough? Or the abstract of an article, is that enough? Well, I always like to say, like, a little bit of knowledge is dangerous, right? Like if you don't really know, if you don't really know the underlying concepts, then you can't navigate through what the findings of the article are, right? You can't really say like, okay, well, this article showed that, and then you look back at the methods that they used, and you're like, they had one subject. Okay, well, I mean, how much support to an idea or concept am I going to get out of trying this on one subject? And you might find that the methods were not that good in the research design, right? And you're like, okay, well, this was a person who has no training history. You and I talked about this one before, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you're looking at people who have zero training history. Like, what are the underlying mechanisms to improve what they're doing? It doesn't matter what you do. I don't need primary research for this, right? Like, you could get the person to stand up and sit down off of the couch a number of times, and all of a sudden they're better at what they're doing because they've done nothing.
Yeah.
So the other issue with the primary research, one thing that you want to look into as an issue with the primary research is, I almost kind of lost my train of thought here for a second, but
you're good, because I actually want to dip back into something you said really quick, because I think this is something that is plaguing the industry, and it's what you said it perfectly. Where if I read an article, you're reading someone's opinion, right? Like if someone comes to the Parisi Speed School, someone's listening to the Parisi podcast, like they're getting our opinion. And I think it's really important when you're reading an article or you're listening to a podcast and someone's like interpreting, quote unquote, interpreting data research, that you are getting their own bias, right? Like you're going to get their own training bias, thought bias, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You just have to understand that if I'm talking to you and you are sports performance to the max, you're like, yep, this is the methodology I use when I train my NFL guys. My pro athletes are doing this, that, and the other thing. And I'm over here on the other side of the screen and I train 45-year-old moms and dads. Like your bias is fine, but it just doesn't necessarily apply to maybe what I'm doing. But because, you're a smart guy, like I believe, and it's like your opinion, I'm like, yeah, this is totally good. But what you said about going to the source, that's that next step, like that one more is that's non-existent, right? Like whether it's the person isn't actually citing the research correctly, which is a bummer, but it's just and research is so accessible. Like go to Google Scholar, you can find anything, right? There's going to be a PDF of almost anything online, or the NSCA puts out publications quarterly, monthly in your membership. Like it's ridiculously accessible. But I didn't want to gloss over that fact, because I thought that's like just a really important piece for a sports performance coach to really understand, is that the article you read is good, it's educational, but it can't be the only piece of your education. You've got to go one more, and you've got to look at the source behind the article, the source behind the opinion. I thought that was so well worded on your end. I just wanted to make sure it was recapped and relived. Yeah, no doubt about it. Like going to the source is important because it's a practice in critical thinking. And that's an aspect that we're really missing, right? You can't get to critical thinking without going to the source. You're getting somebody else's interpretation, their critical thinking process into what they believe the article meant. And one of the points you made is really important, which is like, if I'm working with collegiate athletes, professional athletes, and I'm saying, here's the underlying principles to why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's good and great. But if you're working with 45-year-old moms, you really want to understand more of like, okay, what are the underlying principles he's talking about? What is the source of where he's coming from with this? And then taking that source, you can either apply it or get rid of it, in your demographic, depending on what it is. And that brings up another important point. The specificity of research, right, is so pinpointed. Like for example, like they're going to look at one particular variable that they make an assumption about in a primary research article. So if I want to look at vertical jump as an output of power, right, then that's what you're looking at. And what is it? It's quantifiable,
right? You can quantify the changes that happen because it's easy, right? You don't have a lot that you have to look at there. Did the person significantly on a statistical relevance? Were they able to improve to that statistical relevance in the vertical jump based on A or B, right? Or the group that wasn't supposed to improve and the group that's supposed to improve because I do X. Well, this is so specific that it omits so many other variables, right? And one of the things we have to understand when we read research is that we're reading things that are so pinpointed into here's the one thing that made a change. That's just not how things work in reality, right? And if we look historically, research is actually philosophy.
Whoa, right? So there's a line.
Yeah, research is actually philosophy. And if we look at the way the West works and the way we function, it's based on Aristotle's thinking models, right? His logic, his models of logic, his laws of thinking. And Descartes later on had really put down the scientific method, had really laid it down, right? And these are philosophers. So really the history of research has its root in philosophy. And when we look at that, the only way that they could observe the world was through this really microscopic lens of being able to break down something to its smallest component. And that's what I was saying in the beginning. If you look at our anatomy books, what are they full of? Like you can go down to all these different layers, but are they connected?
Mm-hmm. It's
in the book,
anatomy.
no.
It's just cadaver anatomy.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And so the point that I want to get to here is that it does very little. This thinking process does very little for relativity or the language of relationship. What's the relationship between the different variables? You can't get to, for example, with that kind of philosophy, you can't get to quantum mechanics. You can't get to certain levels of physics. You can't get to what we've observed in different aspects with that type of a thinking model. You need to get through relativity. You got to get to that level. So there's a big difference between looking at research in one aspect to talk about change for your clientele versus looking at a broader array and making connections, which is what I mean by critical thinking. So I have to look at neuroscience. I've got to look at like motor behavior. I got to look at, the physiological adaptations, and I've got to make connections and links between these different subjects in order to come up with something that's more effective for my clients, because those connections are the critical thinking process. Those connections are where you can come up with really solid changes that you can make to your programming that'll have an impact.
Mm-hmm. And I want to take a quick pivot on this critical thinking, because I think that you're 100% spot on. Like, I think our coaches get taught systems sell in a marketing aspect, right? If someone's like, hey, come, I'm on the Parisi side of this, right? Like the Parisi training system, like come learn the Parisi training system. We're going to teach you how to train athletes, and people are going to trust that it's the right system. And luckily we've got people like you and our advisory board that review a lot of what Bill Parisi's huge on this. Like, he wants everything reviewed. And I remember serving as a master coach, like we always had to present once a year original research and application and how it related to the Parisi Speed School. Like, it was, I think, one of the most valuable things I had as a young coach was diving into research, understanding its research methods, which we'll talk about here, and how applicable it was to our population of developing athletes across some spectrum, right? Like youth development under the age of 12 to adolescents, 12 to 16 to 18. And then we'll say like a developed human, 18 to 22 years old in college. Like, we had to do this and it was so important. But if you're a coach, right? Say, not you specifically, but if you're a coach listening to this and you're like, what do I start with that? Like to critically think, to be able to assess, self-audit, like it's really hard. And I'm not going to sit here and say like, yeah, it's just, self-awareness and you got the audit and this, that, and it's like, it's really hard to do. So where does a coach start if they want to improve their ability to critically think? Is it asking like, what is there a process you do? Like when you like look at something and you're like, okay, first I look at this, then I look at this, then I look at this. And if certain boxes aren't getting checked, you're like, okay, now I need to take my thought process one step further. Like, how do you start that critical thinking process? Give some insights for a coach listening to this. That's like, yeah, I would love to think better at my job and profession. How do I start?
Yeah. Thinking models are definitely.
Yeah, I know it's a very deep, deep
right?
question. People are going to be like, well, what do you do? But like what you do isn't necessarily going to work for someone else. But just if you could pull back the curtain a little bit on just, a little bit of I'll say like a 30,000 to 100,000 foot view on just this is probably a good segue into the BS meter, I would think too.
Yeah, I think one of the places you start, as a coach, right, is going to be asking questions. Don't be afraid about asking questions. Questions are going to be the source of what starts to formulate your thinking in the direction you're going to go in what you're studying, what you're trying to support the evolution of your programming with. It's going to, you've got to talk to different people who are doing things out there, and you got to listen to them in a way where you're not, and this is hard. This is the hard part of what I think really makes a good thinker is in a conversation, put aside your assumptions. Like this was like the way Bruce Lee would have said it, right? Is like, if you go in to learn something new, empty your cup, right? Because if your cup is full, you can't put anything new in. It's gonna spill over. So if you're full of opinions, then it's gonna be hard to get anything new. If you really think that your opinions are facts, that also makes your thinking rigid. It means there's no room for growth in your thinking process. So getting to a point where you can kind of put the ego aside and just listen and take the nuggets that you hear in what somebody's saying, and then investigate those a little bit further. And what it should do is it should change your perspective a little bit, or be able to give more support to what you already have as a perspective, and be able to give you more confidence when you have more evidence to suggest what you're doing is going to be helpful, or you understand an underlying concept and you can maneuver how you apply that concept to help the individual. You become very confident in what you're doing, and that comes off of you as well. And your athletes or your clientele, they can improve based on the fact that they believe in you, at that point, because you're really working your butt off to figure out what is going to be the most useful thing I can do for these people. That's kind of I'm kind of getting away from the original question here a little bit.
No, but I think it's just important because it's the start of the process, right? Like if you're listening to this, you're going to have to develop your own process, how you assess, interpret, evaluate, how you ask questions, what questions apply to you and your, I asked Seth a harder question, I think, than people maybe realize, because it's so individual specific. But it's important to hear from a guy like Seth, like one, affirmation, like you should ask questions, right? The cliche of like if you're an athlete, like you should ask your coach why I'm doing this and why. Like if you're a coach, like you should ask why, or like someone's outcome matters, right? Like that's fair. And even if you're not, like, obviously not messaging the author, I'm sure in today's world you could, but like, it's just a healthy discussion, hopefully with colleagues, peers, mentors you have, is to be like, hey, I read this research article on, remember this is like 3 years ago, this was a really big one that came out, was like the weighted like 80% plus load on a sled, improving performance or improving sprint performance. Specifically, I think it was like acceleration. And it was like so polar opposite of the philosophy that I had learned, being like, well, like, why would you ever slow an athlete down that much? Like, that doesn't make any sense, and this, that, and the other thing. And when you went and dove into the research study, you just could, like, just looking at the methods in the population, like the outcomes were true, but it was with fully developed adults. I think it was with graduate students, maybe, in a research lab, that had an athletic background, and they had prerequisite strength. So if you just read the title and the conclusion, and even if you dove into the abstract a little bit, like, you would miss that there's all these prerequisites that should apply. So if I'm a sports performance coach that works with 12-year-olds, I'm over there strapping 80% of this 12-year-old's body weight to him and hoping that he can run fast. And it's going to improve because I read a research study that validates what I said. It doesn't, right? Like, it's missing. I remember having this discussion with other coaches in the network, being like, just because you read a research article, just like you attend a certification, like, it does not mean you get the license or the keys to the car to go do it at will with someone just because a research article says it's going to work. It doesn't work like that. So I think that it was a really good introduction to critical thinking, right? Just this idea of asking why and how it applies. Seems obvious, but the obvious never is really that obvious, I find, in today's world. So
right.
Very important.
Yeah. Once you start diving down the rabbit hole, you learn that the superficial observations that we can make are rarely true. Mm-hmm. Right. And you start to understand a little bit more about the underlying mechanisms of what need to occur, and you can have a different starting point for different people.
Yeah.
It's absolutely. Not all, there's no one way. Right. And there are going to be multiple methods that are true. Right. It's meaning, like, you can see a positive outcome using 2 or 3 or 4 different methods on the same, like, type of group of people. So if I had 12 to 15-year-old athletes and I had 3 or 4 groups of them, and I did something different in each of those groups, and my measurement at the end of that study was 10-yard acceleration and long jump, I could see a significant improvement in all 4 groups. And I did 4 different things. So this is where I think the idea of, like, Aristotle's thinking is if a statement is true, it's true. If it's false, it's false. There is no gray area. There's no room for gray area. You have to exclude anything that even raises the question that it might not be true, then it's false. And that's too black and white. It's too black and white. The other thing about critical thinking, though, just to go back to that, is, like, asking questions doesn't have a starting place. It's not like, you have to ask the right question. No, you just need to start asking questions. Mm-hmm. Like, they don't have to be any at any particular level. You just have to start doing it. And then reading should start to influence your thinking, in that you're asking more questions, right? It's that constant inquiry that allows you to keep evolving. But I think before you even get to the question, the first thing you need, doesn't matter who you are or what you're doing, you need a desire to do it. If you don't have a desire to know, you're not gonna go down that path. Yeah,
it's never gonna work.
You're just not. So either you have to come to the point where you're like, this is what I want to do. There are no questions about it. This is what I'm gonna do. And when you get to that point, when you have that level of desire moving forward, failure, those types of concepts, you have a different perspective on them. I don't, like, those types of thoughts don't even cross your mind, because failures are just opportunities. They're just like they're an opportunity to reflect and learn.
It's another data
and then
point.
you can evolve. It's another data point. You gotta
absolutely.
And if you're really adamant about knowing something, then the more frustration you run into in the process, the better, because the stronger the learning is going to be. So actually, if you look at like school, the harder you fail on something, the more you're going to learn about.
Hopefully.
Like, yeah, you're going to learn. You're going to learn more about
education. And there's definitely instances where I failed and was like, F this. On to the next one. Yeah, no. Hopefully, it sparks a more learning outcome for sure.
Well, if you have that desire, right? If you don't care, then it's a useless endeavor.
Yeah, it goes back to your first point for sure.
Right. But if you have that desire to know, then you're gonna do it.
Yeah,
you're gonna find a way.
Seth, we've danced around it a few times here in this conversation. Like, we're starting to go down that lane on research methods, right? We've referenced it a few times. I think you started talking about it and I was like, wait, I want to go rehatch this thing. And then you just kind of we talked a little bit about research methods and what we look for, and if it's applicable to either the demographic we work with, and I love what you said, like, the research method may show 4 different ways of doing something. All 4 received a positive outcome, but because the research article is keying in on one thing, you dive into that lane first. But specifically when it comes to research methods, if you're a sports performance coach, you've got your NSCA journal right in front of you, and you're like, okay, squat performance and the vertical jump output, right? Like, you're like looking at it, you're like, okay, this is totally it. Like, I work with basketball players, like I squat in my program, like this is going to be sweet. Like, it applies to me. Like, I'm looking at it, and you start to look and actually read the article. You're like, okay, this research is 3 pages. Like, I totally have the bandwidth for this. Now you're seeing how I read research. I'm like, 12 pages. Meta study over how many years? Tough one. Like this guy. But like, what, talk to me a little bit about research methods. What do you like to see? Right? Like, what do you look for? Like, if you're reading through it, you're like, oh, this is how you did it. Okay. Or if you're like, this is how you did it. Like, cross that out. Like, it's cute, but doesn't really apply. Like, obviously there's some serious context behind that, but if we could just start the conversation there, I think we'll unearth some nuggets for the listeners.
Yeah. I think one of the things I do when I see a title that I'm attracted to in a research article, I take a look at the references right away. So I flip straight to the back, the references. I read what each reference is. So I'm taking a look at the articles that they're going to be expanding on. I'm looking at the concept kind of behind where they're coming from. So I take a look at all the references. I also, in the references, I'll highlight the ones that I'm going to also study. So like what we said before is you're still reading an opinion. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Yeah. Even though there's quantifiable data in there, they're still going to go into the conclusions and discussion with some bias. So I'm going to go deeper from that research article and look at the previous research articles that they found useful for the concept so that I can get more along the thinking line that they're on and see if I can kind of sanity check it, right? And say, all right, well, yeah, I think this is good, but I think they left this out, So the references are a big part. Then when I'm looking at the methods, what I'm looking for is the subjects. I want to see how many subjects are in there. What's the history on the subjects, right? Where was
so
this?
Big. So big.
The history on the subjects. What's their training history? What's their age group? How many of them are there in each group? And then you're also going to see in there how many of them didn't complete it because they weren't able to stick to what they were supposed to be doing, right, for this research article. The other thing you have to remember during these research articles, like if you're looking at a 4-week, 6-week, 8-week program, and you're looking at the changes based on the exercise that they wanted to focus on or the program they wanted to focus on, these athletes are going to do stuff outside of there. So you can only control so much of the variables that actually go into the result. So for example, if I'm doing like, I was part of this study when I was at Springfield College where we did a maximal bench press on one day. And then it was like 1 week or 2 weeks later, you went in and did it again, and you weren't supposed to train in between. How many 21, 22, 23-year-olds are you going to get to stop lifting weights for 2 straight weeks because they're a part of this study?
Right.
You're not. They're all going to go do something. So this is going to it's going to skew the results. The results can only be based on these quantifiable measurements, and you can't account for all this extra stuff outside, which we can refer to as noise, right? Like you have they're going to tell you in the methods what the major parameter is that they're going to test, right? And then they give you how they test it. Like they're going to tell you, we use this level of statistical analysis. We're going to use these devices to measure the outcome. Here's the protocol. It's that protocol that I'm saying as well is super important, right? You don't get this in the abstract and you don't get it in the conclusion. You got to go to the meat of the
actual middle pages of the article. Yeah.
Right. And it's the stuff you don't really want to read because it's just boring. But if you can understand those things, and one of the things I did is like, I don't understand much. Like when it comes to words and stuff like they have in those research articles, that's another language. Mm-hmm. Right. So I in the beginning, I had to stop every other word and look the word up. That's okay. You know what it does? It improves your understanding of what the sentence means.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got to getting over like not knowing what the heck you're reading is fine. Just look the words up and then make the connection. That's your start in critical thinking. You start to learn how to investigate to improve the understanding of what you're looking at. And that's a huge part of the process. So just learning how to learn by using primary research is a good example of how to do that. Is a great way to start that process. Those protocols. Yeah.
I just want to jump in here because I come from a business background. My background is in stats and analytics. So I understood research, how to read research, but moving into the field of sports performance, I didn't understand like exercise science, lingo, terminology, and that, I guess like that sub language in a way. So yeah, I could understand statistical probability and whatever, but it didn't help me when I was looking at just straight, sometimes like ex-phys terms, right? Like just cellular level biology. Like I just like, this is Greek to me, right? So one thing that really helped me as a younger sports performance coach, I distinctly remember doing this on Sunday mornings. I would look at one article that caught my interest a month. Like I'd go through the smaller like sports strength conditioning journals, not the big thick blue ones from the NSCA, but like the nice color copies that were tending to like a little shorter. They were a little easier to read. I picked one that would fit my interest. And every week for an hour, I remember doing this on Sunday morning, I would just set a timer and I would just dive into it and I'd either look up the words. And a lot of times I'd have to spend the first 3 weeks doing exactly what you just said, like translating what it was, little Post-it notes everywhere. And what it did was help me understand the industry better, research better. And then from there, I could have conversations with, and I would distinctly remember doing this with Steve Leo, just having conversations and being like, hey, what do you think about this? Or I was reading about such and such a process. Like, have you ever tried that? Have you seen it? And this is where I think for younger sports performance coaches, like research can further your education, but it can also help further your career because it's going to give you good talking points. It's going to help you unearth terminology that is going to set you apart in the next job interview. And it's also, you're just going to be able to have better conversations with industry colleagues and peers because like they have the non-theory side, right? Like a research article is great. That's super controlled, as controlled as we can get. But then all of a sudden you talk to someone who's been in the trenches coaching your population, and they're like, that's definitely true. I've used that a few times, but given either the population, the size of the group, like the actual practicality of coaching, like that's where the two worlds meet. And that's where just understanding the research, but being able to bounce those ideas off of a colleague, a mentor in the profession is the other side of it. So I share that story only as I think maybe a practical approach to, like Seth would probably tell you that he reads research almost daily, but like for a younger professional who maybe isn't interested in it as much or wants to start going with it, like set a timer for an hour on a Sunday morning, pour yourself a cup of coffee, dive into one article a month. At the end of the year, you've read 12 related articles on your profession, and all the subsequent education from there, it's arguably better than what your undergraduate degree could give you.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're doing it on your own.
It's huge.
And when you can do it on your own, if you learn how to learn, while you take yourself through that process, that's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to differentiate yourself from the rest of the field.
And you're going to put yourself, great way to do it. This is a great way to do it.
Yeah. You put yourself in a position where you can do what you're doing now or what I'm doing now. Mm-hmm. And, this is the evolution of like a career. And if you want your career to evolve, this is really a necessary step. It really is. It might not be something like that you enjoy doing at first, but it'll become something that you will enjoy doing because you're going to notice in your conversations with clientele, you're going to notice in your conversations with other professionals in the field that all of a sudden you really have something to bring to the table. You have a new way of thinking. You have a new perspective on the problem because you have this information. Now, one of the things I like to do with that information is actually see it right here. Like, so I have a note card with a research study written on it. And on the back, I write the participants, the design, the results. And I just put them on the back of the note card. So I take a full article and I make it into one note card. The other thing I try to do is say, okay, from this article, after I've read it word for word, maybe even gone down the rabbit hole and looked at some of their references, I try to make one statement. What's the take-home message? And if you can start distilling it down to these levels where, one, you've got the entire article on a note card. I don't really, if I determine the article not to be worthy, I'm not going to do this. But if for a good article, I'm going to put it into that. Then when you're talking about the subject, like you can just back up what you want to do, referencing this information, and you need a logical way to put it into practice. That's the next step, right? Like one is the information in the article. Two is how do you make it real?
Yeah.
How do you make it tangible? What's that process? Like you're taking something from paper to reality. That's another skill in itself.
Involving
I think we talked about that, right?
Multiple human beings. Yeah. If going from a research study in a lab, a controlled environment, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, I have 5 14-year-olds that I'm hoping that I can, and I think that's for coaches, I think research on a surface level can validate your coaching practices, right? Like the exercise selection you choose, the implements that you're doing, and it can move the needle in the right direction on the outcomes for your clients. But it's important to understand that the client is the ultimate variable, right? Just like in any research study, like you're saying, Seth, like how many people dropped out? like who is the people do, like, we don't know like how hard they actually tried during the control process. Like there's so many things that we don't know, and we have to be okay with that as sports performance coaches, that just because a study showed this result, you might do the same or similar type thing with our clients in real life and not achieve that result at all. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It just means that it didn't work in this instance. And that's part of science. And it's just a reflection point, and you move on from there.
Yeah. If it's true in the context of the study, does not mean it's going to be true when you put it into application.
Facts.
And that's because we reduce the variables down to what we can measure, and we don't have much. If we look at it, it's such a small percentage of what's going on that we can measure. I'm not saying primary research is not valid or it's not important. It is important, but we also have to come at it from the perspective that we are limited in our ability to observe. And we talked about it in the beginning. Our ability to observe is improving, right? And that's why it's important to keep up with stuff. I've also noticed, like in college, when I was in college and grad school, when you had to evaluate primary research and you had to use primary research to validate what you were doing, one of the issues I found with it is you could only go back X number of years. And then the research study was considered like not valid. And that's a huge mistake, in my opinion, because there are absolute gems in the older research that you would have never seen if you didn't go back. I remember distinctly having a situation down in Florida where Pete Bommarito gave like a talk at an NSCA sponsored event. And I looked at his references and I saw this one article, Intermuscular Coordination in a Sprint Push-Off. I believe it was 1992 in the Netherlands that one was done. And I was like, well, I never heard of the article, never seen the article because it was too old at the time. Like I was doing my like independent study. So I couldn't even look at something like that. Yet I honestly, that article, it took me, like you said, it took 30 days for me to decipher the language in this article. But once I kind of got a grip on what it was actually saying, it changed everything for me, like on understanding a lot of the underlying mechanisms that are occurring in the body during acceleration, during that second step of acceleration. The article study was actually done with 100-meter sprinters who run a 10.5 or better.
Fast,
and they fast, very fast people. So it was like, okay, well, you're getting a good idea here on the forces that they're able to generate. In the Netherlands, they were able to put like force transducers embedded into the Achilles like tendon and the soleus. So we can't do that kind of stuff here, where they were invasive on how they measured some of the things that were going on. And that's something you want to look at too in the research. In Europe, they're able to do a lot of that stuff. So when you're looking at research and you see where it's coming from and how they measured things, you can get into some of the, I would say, better observations of what's going on with some of that research.
I never knew that. I just learned something, because you see where research articles come from, you see the publications, and like the country they're from, but that I guess the research methods, it sounds like a duh moment, but research methods country to country vary dramatically, I would think. Right. For sure. Yeah, they do. So that's where you can get some really interesting stuff. You can see some pretty invasive I would think
methods.
That anytime you're cutting someone open to put a mechanical piece in them for the sake of research, like that's pretty intense on the scale. Seth, where do people go to find more Seth? Because I know we're going to do a part 2 on this podcast. Like I feel like we barely just smashed the tip of the iceberg. But where can people go to get more Seth, stuff you're involved with? And I'll make sure all this again is in the show notes.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question because I'm really not like a social media
If you know, you know. This is where you find
person.
Seth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. It's, but for me, I'm always accessible. I'm always open to having discussions about this because I love this stuff. It's like a burning desire of mine to just keep attaining knowledge and have conversations. And a lot of times I'm asked questions that help me go in directions I didn't think of before. So if people want to reach out to me, they could always email me as well. I'm open, like, yeah, to be able to talk with coaches that way and stuff too.
Nice. And Seth will be on our sports performance mentorship this spring. I have a feeling that conversation is on programming, specifically linear speed programming, but I have a feeling, Seth, you and I will do another podcast at some point in the near future. Maybe part 2 of this, because I feel like there's so much more to talk about.
Yeah, there is a lot to talk about. I guess you were right in the beginning saying
you and I could go for
probably
hours on this. You and I
Yeah.
are chatty. We could go for hours on this. And I think it's because, like you said earlier, it's like we're so close to the information, like we're so close to this as our profession, our career, that it's something we're passionate about. So it's an easy conversation to have. Like it's not a hard one to pick up the whole Zoom and start shooting the breeze with you on anything in the industry, you know?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I know this subject matter can be kind of dry. Hopefully we brought some type of life to it a little bit anyway.
Yeah, well, I think we brought the practicality to it, you know, like how people can, because it's an important piece, right? That was the first question. Like, how important is research in 2022? Like, it's important. And here's how you go about looking at it and understanding it. And if you want to be successful in this and have longevity in this career, this is something you really need to start looking at.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Seth, thank you so much for joining part 1. That means that we're going to do a part 2, and I'll talk to you again soon. Like, I think tomorrow.
Sounds good.